Hello and welcome. Here are breaking stories from outside Africa. Former French President Nicolas Sarkozy has been released from prison after a Paris court granted his appeal against a corruption conviction. Sarkozy was jailed in September for allegedly using Libyan funds to finance his 2007 presidential campaign. Appearing via a video link, the ex-president described his 20 days behind bars as very hard, but thanked prison staff for their humanity. Reports say Sarkozy ate only yogurt during his stay, fearing his food could be tampered with. Under his release terms, he cannot leave France or contact individuals linked to his case, including Justice Minister Gérald Darmanin. He continues to insist on his innocence as he awaits his appeal hearing. Let's move away from that to tell you that Thailand has suspended a peace agreement with neighboring Cambodia after a landmine explosion injured 2 Thai soldiers near the border. The deal, brokered by former U.S. President Donald Trump, was meant to end months of cross-border clashes that left dozens dead and displaced hundreds of thousands. Prime Minister Anutin Chanvirakul said the attack showed that the security threat has not decreased. Bangkok says the accord's next steps, including the release of 18 Cambodian soldiers, will now be halted.
ตอนนี้ก็ต้องเรียนว่าผมก็จะแจ้งไปยังกระทรวงกลาโหมและกระทรวงต่างประเทศว่าต้องทำตามสิ่งที่ประเทศไทยต้องการเท่านั้นสิ่งที่มันเกิดขึ้นนี้ทำให้ความเป็นปฏิปักษ์ที่เราคิดว่ามันจะลดลงไปต่อความมั่นคงของชาติมันไม่ได้ลดเมื่อมันไม่ได้ลดเราก็ดำเนินการอะไรนอกเหนือจากนี้ไม่ได้นะครับเกิดขึ้นเมื่อสักครู่นี้นะครับที่ทหารไทยไปเหยียบกับระเบิดนะครับในเขตแดนไทยนะครับเป็นสิ่งที่รัฐบาลเนี่ยยอมรับไม่ได้ท่านนายกให้การสนับสนุนการดำเนินการทุกอย่างของกองทัพและการดำเนินการตามข้อตกลง Joint Declaration ที่ดำเนินการมานะครับได้ประมาณสักสัปดาห์หนึ่งแล้วเนี่ยก็ต้องหยุดไปก่อน
Now, South Africa is abuzz with anticipation as the countdown begins for the G20 summit set to take place on November 22 and 23 in Johannesburg. World leaders are expected to converge on Africa's economic hub. Last year, South Africa took over the G20 presidency from Brazil, and News Central's Bongani Siziba has the details for us in this report.
Are in full swing here at the Nazareth Center, showcasing South Africa's readiness to host the significant international event. But beneath the air, political tensions continue to simmer. U.S. President Donald Trump publicly stated he will not attend, citing concerns over what he describes as genocide in South Africa.
You know, I'm not going to, we have a G20 meeting in South Africa. South Africa shouldn't even be in the Gs anymore because what's happened there is bad. I'm not going. I told him I'm not going. I'm not going to represent our country there. It shouldn't be there.
South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has responded firmly, insisting that the summit will go on regardless of the U.S. decision. Ramaphosa also made the country's priorities clear.
We expect the summit to make a clear political commitment to address debt vulnerabilities that low-income and middle-income countries are suffering under at the moment. We want to see the issue of the cost of debt being addressed because many countries are having to spend the income or the revenue they have largely to pay back debt and not to advance their people's developmental needs.
Meanwhile, despite the sour relations between the U.S. and South Africa, discussions on the trade relations are still ongoing, with President Cyril Ramaphosa emphasizing the importance of collaboration and dialogue.
The noise between our two countries has quietened down, and we are now engaged in serious discussions with the United States, particularly their trade office. And that for us is a great advance.
In a show of regional unity, South Africa has reaffirmed Nigeria's role as a key partner, highlighting its growing influence and advocating for Nigeria's inclusion in the G20.
Nigeria will be keenly supported by us because we've been a member of the G20 as a lone voice for the longest time.
South Africa is expected to pass the G20 presidents to United States. However, as challenges and debates remain, the world's eyes are on Johannesburg, where the leaders will come together to shape the global's future. In Johannesburg, for News Central, Bongani Siziba.
We turn our lens to Syria, a nation emerging from more than a decade of devastating civil war, and nearly 1 million displaced Syrians have returned home since the fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime last December, a moment many saw as the dawn of a new era. But as hope flickers, deep challenges remain, and that is a shattered economy, widespread destruction, lingering insecurity, and a humanitarian crisis affecting millions. We explore whether these mass return signals real recovery or the beginning of another struggle for survival. And joining us for further discussions on this is Yemi Fajemisi, is a geopolitics analyst. Thank you so much, Yemi, for joining us again on Beyond the Continent.
Thank you.
All right, you're welcome. So let's look at the Syria imbroglio critically. What does the return of 1 million citizens, of course, of the Syrian population signify for the country's political and social stability?
Yeah, thanks. I think, again, it's important to look at let's go back to some of the background information, then we move ahead from there. So what exactly led to situation of 1 million people returning to Syria? So we know some of the background around the March of 2011. There was a case of peaceful protesters that wanted the Assad regime to go. And Bashar Assad, being the president there, responded with force. And he did that that's usually what his father would have done. So let's not forget that Assad's father ruled Syria for about 30 years before his death in 2000, and Bashar Assad took over. So it was the repression, let's say, of the peaceful protesters escalated to civil war that lasted more than a decade. So that led to about over 500,000 people killed, 6.5 million people internally displaced, and about 3 million people fled Syria. So Syria actually overtook Afghanistan as the source of the largest refugees in the world. So back to your question, in terms of people returning, I think we can say it's still fragile for now. The only thing we know for now is that there was a poll that was done recently around people going back to Syria. And interestingly, about 70% of the respondents kind of painted a picture of, they were optimistic about the future of Syria. So I think in a way, that's a good thing. Okay. And what we should also kind of acknowledge is Mr. Shara, which is the new president of Syria. He himself used to be a jihadist, now turning a new leaf, being an interim president. He's been trying his best and he's been encouraging some opposition to form. So this response towards that opposition in due course, I think, is going to define his presidency. Okay. But in a way, I think for now, most of the people returning are painting a picture of optimistic future of Syria. Okay,
even before we begin to paint optimistic and probably bright future for Syrians, let's even understand, how did the fall of Assad regime, how did it reshape governance and power dynamics in Syria from the way you've seen it?
Right. It's let's just say after the fall of Assad, the foundation is still quite fragile now, because one thing we should acknowledge is the fact that Syria is a complex, multi-ethnic and multi-religious setting. So we at the moment we still have a case of some Kurdish militia. They're still holding on. They're still quite active on the northern side of Syria, and we still have the prospect of Islamic State, which is a very notorious terrorist group. There's still prospects of them springing forward as well. So I think what Mr. Shara has been doing so far after taking over is to appeal to all these factions, to disband them, appeal to them to lay down their arms. And I think what he's trying to do is to absorb them into the national army. They're trying to create a national Syrian army and take all these militias in there. So that's not going to be straightforward. Because one thing we should also acknowledge from what we discovered so far is the members of the leadership of the Syrian government at the moment consist of some of the minorities in the Syrian society. And also, interestingly, involves a woman and a technocrat. So that's still a sign that the dynamics of power, even though it's still fragile, there's a hope. We can say there's a possibility of hope going forward. Okay, so that seems to probably solve the military or insecurity issues, or probably even the political aspect of the country. What about infrastructure? And when you look at the scale of destruction in the country, do you think that the Syrian interim government, so to speak, is actually prepared and probably has the wherewithal to rebuild infrastructure and, if possible, restore essential services to the people? Yeah, I think what we should, for now, is important to acknowledge that things are still really bad in Syria. There's still a lot of shortfall of cash. In fact, as I speak to you, the Syrian government have not been able to pay civilians and the civil servants, I beg your pardon. They've not been able to. So that tells us that there's still cash shortfall there. However, the Western governments have been, they've came forward to relax some of the sanctions on Syria. But I think that's going to go a long way to help rebuild the Syrian economy, as Turkey helps as well. But in terms of the readiness of the government, I think the government for now, they're showing the signs of they're ready. They want the sanctions to be lifted ASAP for them to rebuild. So it's a case of seeing the behavior of the new president, because they want to make sure the country is not going to get taken over by jihadists. So it's two things. So you want to make sure the country doesn't get taken over by jihadists. To do that, you need to lift sanctions on the Syrian economy. If you don't, then you risk the country falling back into the hands of extremists. So it's a two double-edged sword there. But in terms of the readiness of the government, I think the government is pretty much showing that they're ready to rebuild and to move things forward. Okay, so earlier on you said that there's a bit of optimism in the air as regards life getting better in this new era in Syria, but then there's still issues around unexploded ordnances, economic struggle, like you pointed out, insecurity is a little bit still fragile. But then what hope is there amidst all these challenges that people will still be able to ease a sigh of relief and probably be able to get back to living their lives? Yeah, I think there's hope there, because one thing we should acknowledge is the last time President Trump went to the Gulf region, he went to the UAE, he went to the Saudi, remember the Qatar government gave, as a president, gave President Trump a $400 million jet called the Palace in the Sky. The Saudis decided to invest many billions of dollars in U.S. government. So one thing we should understand is the Arabs didn't do all these things for fun. So one of the negotiations, one of the deals that I was struck with President Trump is to lift sanctions. So they did these things, invested into the U.S. economy in exchange for lifting sanctions on Syria. So what that means is Syria is going to be reconnected back to the global economy. Syria is going to be reconnected back into the banking system, as you saw. So at the moment now, anything Syria's exports now, they find it difficult to even get paid for those goods. So it paints us a very picture of a very dire picture of what's going on. So they're exporting stuff, but they're not getting money back. Why? Because of the sanctions. So the Western government, President Trump, they're all coming together now to say, okay, we're going to be lifting sanctions on Syria gradually. So I think as time goes by, we should be beginning to see a bit of good things and flowing back to Syria as they build up. All right. Well, let's hope for good times to come for Syria at this particular time, now that we're beginning to see a little bit of change in the regime and, of course, the political trajectory. Thank you so much, Yemi Fajemisi, geopolitics analyst, for sharing your thoughts with us on Beyond the Continent. Thank you for having me.
And that's it on Beyond the Continent. So we move on now. Well, nearly 1 million Syrians have returned home since the fall of Assad. But hope is fragile amid a shattered economy, a persistent insecurity, and a deepening humanitarian crisis. And that is the way we see it. But then we go on a break and return to look at the conversation proper, even as we turn our attention to Africa. And we will be examining the unfolding crisis in Sudan and Tanzania, from thousands fleeing Darfur to hundreds charged with treason. Well, there's been a lot to talk about in those two countries. So stay with us. We'll be back in a bit.